So, welcome everybody. And just a quick bit of housekeeping. We actually do still fit all onto one screen, but if more people turn up, we might not. So, does everybody know how to raise a hand in case you want to say something? So, for those who don't, if you go down to the bottom of your screen and you find reactions, which at the moment I can't see. Oh, yes, there it is. You find reactions, it's got a heart on my screen. And if you press that, you will find a bar saying raise hand. And can you see it immediately jumps whoever raises hand to the top left corner. And then there's another box saying lower hand. So just to check everybody knows how to do this. And can I also take the opportunity to introduce Brenda, who is also there?
Hi, everybody.
Brenda's giving me so much help in the background, doing all the emails, and I'm so grateful to her. It's wonderful to have her, and it means I can get on with writing course information and content, which is fantastic. Thank you, Brenda. So, right, let's start. I am Penelope Easten, for those who hadn't guessed, and I'm going to outline my research for you on the origins of the Alexander technique that I've been working on for the last 3 years intensively, and before that, of course, as well. And on April the 5th, I'm launching an 8-module course that fleshes all this out because we're going to look at the bones of it today. So I guess that everybody here will have read The Use of the Self, in particular, the first chapter, Evolution of a Technique. It's a compelling story. It's neat. It's wonderfully inspiring, and it's very easy to summarize for pupils and for publicity as well. It's a great marketing tool as well. But one has to ask now, how factual is it? Hello, Sue. Really nice to see you. And Marion, too. That's wonderful. You're obviously better, Sue, because last time I heard you were really ill. So that's wonderful. You're back on your feet. Thank you. So, yes, in my book, which was published 4 years ago now, I gave a summary of, I made my first attempt at doing a summary of how I thought the technique really had evolved. And unfortunately, at the point at which I went to print, I already knew that some of those facts weren't spot on. And I had to make a decision in the last few months whether to prioritize getting the history spot on or getting the science really up to full speed. And I chose the science at that point. And I thought, well, when the book actually goes to the printer, there'll be a year of preparation, and I can do the research and get the history stuff really more accurate at that point. And of course, that is when COVID broke, and it plunged me into online teaching, helping everybody who wanted to work online. And so it never happened. And so it was sad that I knew it went to print with inaccuracies in the history section, and I wasn't entirely sure what was true and what was false at that point. So a year later, not surprisingly, a couple of senior teachers attacked me. One was a very well modulated, this, and this, which was fine. It was respectful. The other was a bit of a finger poker, which wasn't so nice, but hey, that's life. But it made me realize I've got to get this work done. I've got to do the history research. So I set to thinking it would be a few months' work. And the more I dug, the more I delved, the more questions turned up, the more I realized there was something I wasn't catching. There was something that wasn't right. There was something that didn't gel. And so I kept digging, and inspirations would come, usually at 4 in the morning. And slowly a new picture came together, and it's taken 3 years. And it's been the most amazing, fascinating, and totally obsessive journey. My family has been very patient with me. So here we are, and now we can actually look at the whole story. I've realized I haven't shut my door. I'm just going to do that in case the dog comes invading. So, the news story is based on facts, evidence, um, but obviously also some speculation because there are gaps. There are big gaps where we really don't know, where there isn't any evidence, and we just have to guess, do our best guesses. So I'm going to give you the facts, and I'm also going to give you my best guesses, and then you can make up your own mind and maybe make some different guesses. And I'm always very interested to hear other people's guesses too. So let's define the problem. The several key inconsistencies between the use of the self account and the currently known facts. Because we now know that Alexander originally taught breathing and elocution, but this is not mentioned in use of the self. Breathing is mentioned in use of the self, but it's always mentioned as the problem. There is at no point is breathing mentioned as the solution or part of the solution. We also know that he studied and even taught the Delsart method early on, but this is also not mentioned. In 1900 or thereabouts, his Sydney business card advertised, along with voice and breathing work, it said it offered the famous Delsart system as applied to dramatic expression, deportment, gesture, and vocalization. And it has been suggested that Alexander developed his work out of the Delsart method. Certainly, when I first met Jean de Masuero 8 years ago, that was what he was saying at that point, that Alexander simply repackaged Delsart work. Now, I don't think that. Alexander was a genius. I think there's no doubt about that. He was an incredibly creative man, and like all geniuses and creatives, he used other people's methods and ideas as springboards to develop his own ideas, and that's inevitable, I think. And one weaves it with one's own creativity to create something new. It was something that was acceptable then to say, I did it all myself. I'm not sure anyone doing what he did now would make that claim, but he was then. So, that's how they did things then. To what extent was the Delsart work a springboard for the Alexander technique, and what can we learn by investigating those Delsart methods? And that's one of the questions I'll be answering. And another conundrum, and you can either put this one in the chat or hold up 10 fingers, hold up fingers. I heard he took 10 years to develop the Alexander technique work. Would people like to hold up fingers as to how many you heard? You heard 6, Tessa. You heard 10. You heard 11. Yes. You heard 10. It's always fascinating. 9. Fantastic. Yeah, lots 10 from Mary, 10 from Robin. Yeah, there's lots 10 from Sue, 10 from Carol, 9 from Carol. Yeah, so there's lots of different versions out there, which makes one suspicious that this is not a hard fact. And I certainly assumed for a long time that he didn't start working until that 10 years was up, until he put the whole package together. I don't know whether anyone else made that assumption. No, but I think I've met other people who made that assumption too. But actually, we now know that he was teaching within a year of his voice problems, and that somehow it looked like Alexander work. And there's a little piece of evidence for this, was told from a story by Carrington. There was an elderly woman who, in the 1940s, came to Ashley Place to have a lesson. And it turned out she'd been in one of, hi Wes, good to see you. And yes, and Desiree as well. That's good to see you too. It turned out that she had taken a lesson with Alexander back in Auckland in 1895. She'd been in one of his very first groups of people that he'd worked with. And decades later, she happened to be in London and she remembered it so well, she sought him out and she took a lesson. And she went away happy, apparently. She went away smiling down the road. And Alexander then turns to Carrington and said, My goodness, what I must have been doing with my hands back then. So that tells us he was actually using his hands, and there's Marjorie Barlow also confirmed that. He told her the same thing, that he was using his hands from the beginning. So that suggests if he was putting hands from the beginning, what was he teaching? Was he first a breathing man and then developed the Alexander technique as two distinct techniques? And that's rather the conclusion that Jerome Starring comes to in his book, his enormous tome of a book. Or somehow was he teaching Alexander technique from the start, but calling it breathing work as this was the hot topic of the day? And I understand that that was Carrington's assumption. Or perhaps the third possibility, that what he was doing looked like Alexander technique, but in various key ways actually was not. So we'll just hold that thought open. So Use of the Self was published in 1932, and it coincided pretty well with the start of the first training course. So it became the manual. Students were told, this is what you're trying to do. It was presented as the method to follow. But I would suggest it's really the goal. It's what Alexander could do after 40 years of work. It's not necessarily the path for a beginner. And he said, you can do what I do if you do what I did, but none of you have now I forget what the phrase was, patience, determination, I forget, but something like that. And maybe if the real reason they couldn't do it was that there were pieces of the puzzle that were missing, that perhaps he didn't tell us the whole story, and there were bits they needed to know really to be able to do what he did. And one can speculate why he didn't fill in all this other stuff, as we're going to see. There's the thought that I've thought myself, perhaps he wanted to keep it simple. Somebody this morning was saying Dewey encouraged him to keep it simple and leave out extraneous bits so that it became a very clear scientific argument based on the Dewey way of doing science. And it was written as a scientific proof, as it were, of the technique. And I think that could well be part of the story. But also, as we'll see, he stopped teaching some elements very early on and simply didn't go back to them. And that could have been because he'd, been there, done that. He'd moved on. He'd lost interest in that. And he didn't want to confuse people. And maybe even he suppressed some for as protection of his practice, as we'll see. So we don't know. I would love to get FM in a corner and pin him down and say, will you please answer these questions? But obviously one can't do that now, sadly. But this means that that we are attempting to do here, and that I'll be doing on my course, is not just an academic exercise. It really can help to know what he did. If we are to do as he did, we need to know what he did, so that we really can follow in his footsteps. So I suspect that because Use of the Self was presented as the book to follow, that this has then distorted how we think about the earlier books and the earlier articles. FM always said it's all in the books, which it isn't, but that's a story for another talk. But the books were always in print in his lifetime, and he ensured that. But since the people who were reading, none of you have the discipline, thank you, Wes, of course. Yes, it should roll off the tongue, usually does, but not today. Senior moment or something, oh God. Because the people who were reading Use of the Self first were people on the training courses, they were people working with him. And then, of course, they took that into going back to read Man's Supreme Inheritance and CCC. And when you're trying to interpret those early books from the basis of use of the self, it actually makes them very hard to understand. And it creates distortions in understanding. So I want to show you the books from another perspective. I want to say, forget use of the self for the moment, forget what you know about primary control, and actually start at the beginning and just read them as if you've never read anything else before, and try things as if you know nothing. And then another picture emerges that gives us a ground floor experience of the technique. FM's books are full of guff, full of padding, full of fillers, as we know, they're maddening. But if you pick through and just pick out the lines that actually matter, and if you know where to look, there's actually a lot of instruction in there. And one can pick through and find that. And there's a lot of information there. So let's now start at the beginning with a rather bold statement. The Alexander technique has its origins at Alexander's birth, because, as most of you will know, Alexander was born premature, probably 34 to 37 weeks, maybe early, quite early on. And preterm babies struggle to breathe. Their lungs are not yet fully developed. They've not enough air sacs, the membranes are too thick, they don't have the surfactant to make them springy. It's just everything is wrong still. And for them, every breath is hard work. It's a life or death struggle even. It's a panicky moment trying to breathe. So preterm babies develop strategies to help themselves. They often grunt at the end of the out-breath to stop the air sacs collapsing, and that collapses, that depresses the larynx. And then when they draw the breath in, which they can only do through the nostrils because babies can't mouth breathe, then they have to work awfully hard and strain the chest up. And of course, they pull their head back and flare their nostrils and tighten their backs. So let's try that. Let's all, for this moment, be preterm babies, and horrible that it is. So breathe out hard and grunt, and then breathe in through your nostrils as hard as you can. You're straining to breathe in, you're pushing the air out, you're straining to breathe in, you're pushing the air out. Anybody like to tell me what that's like, apart from horrible? What do you notice? This is where everybody goes quiet. Come on, talk. Mary. Hi, Mary. No, Mary's disappeared. Anyone else?
A lot of tension in the throat.
Yeah, tremendous tension in the throat. Yeah, thanks. And Sue agrees there. Anything else? Anyone think they're using their diaphragm or? It's all in the chest. Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, it's clavicular breathing. It's really the chest heaving up and down. Anyone aware of tightening their necks like fury? Yeah, pulling back the head. Yeah, absolutely. It's horrible. And that is apparently what you see in preterm babies. And that then creates the feeding problem, because if the baby is fighting to breathe, pulling its head back, and you then put milk into the mouth, they will choke. They will just vomit and they will throw it out again. And I learnt all this from a woman called Jennifer Kello, who is now an Alexander teacher, but she was and still is a preterm baby nurse. Robin, you obviously know her work. And she observed these patterns in her little patients and realized this is what FM must have gone through. And as I say, all the facts fit, not being able to hold milk down, and then the breathing attacks he then suffered all the way through childhood. Absolutely. Yeah, FM's mum had to feed him with a dropper because he couldn't breastfeed. She literally dripped milk into his mouth, probably round the clock, to bring him through. I mean, what a dedicated woman, and we all have her to thank. And as somebody told me as well that, or I read somewhere that actually he still had breathing attacks the rest of his life, from time to time. I don't know whether that was true, but certainly as a child and a young man. And Kello believes that when the preterm baby discovers how to breathe in this way, they think they've sorted the problem. And so many preterm babies keep these habits into adulthood. Oh, Jennifer will be presenting at the Congress. That's great news. Thank you for that snippet. Because a preterm baby has never experienced a normal breath. And so that was FM. He'd never experienced a normal breath, if we're correct on this. He'd actually never experienced a normal breath. And that would then distort everything, as you can see from what you've just experienced. And we'll go into FM's childhood in much more detail on the new course. And anyone who joins the course will have access to Jen's paper as well. She's very kindly given it to me for course participants. So FM, not surprisingly, was then a very sickly child, but he recovered his health at the age of 8, which also fits because that apparently is the age at which the preterm baby's lung finally catches up its development. And he then was able to participate in the outdoor life of the Tasmanian child of that time. He was swimming and, I guess climbing the hills and swimming in the creeks and doing lots with horses, riding horses, training horses. And one can assume, because he was still a delicate child, he never was a big bulky child, that he would not have had the strength to bully a horse. We saw a lot of big men in Ireland who bullied horses into submission. FM would not have been able to do that. And did he build his skills in observation of movement, his ability to calm somebody who's frightened, who's dysregulated, to connect, to direct use through intent, through training horses, because he would have had to have used every skill he had rather than bully power to bring horses into doing what he wanted. And I know I'm not the only one to suggest that. So when he was, I think, 17, 1885, he moved to Waratah, which about 50 miles out of where he grew up, taking clerical jobs because he had to start supporting the family because he was eldest son. And it was there that he discovered acting. And he already loved Shakespeare, and he discovered acting and realized he really wanted to pursue it. So in 1889, he moved to Melbourne, which had an incredibly thriving theatrical scene. And he did a lot of acting training and was able to join amateur productions. And he took clerical jobs again to support himself. And I and others believe that this is when he first learnt the Delsart system as part of his acting training. And he might even have started it in Waratah. We don't know. So what did he learn? And let's first ask, who was Delsart? So Francois Delsart was born in France in 1811, and he died in 1871, having never left France. He had a lovely voice. He was a brilliant singer. And so when he was, 14 or something, he got sent to the Paris Conservatoire. And he then worked as a singer for some years, but he later lost his voice. And he blamed his training because it had been a copy-me method, only based on personal idiosyncrasies, no real system behind it. And he said to himself, there has to be a better way. And he set out to create a systematic and scientific method. And so he created the Delsart system of gestural training. It was the first systematic training for actors that there was. And what Delsart saw, because he went and observed a lot of people in different situations, and he saw that people had poor habits of movement, which restricted, if you were then an actor, restricted their ability to express themselves fully on stage. And he realized that these poor habits resulted from their over-involvement with their bodies. And he saw, the way he said it was, their minds are tangled in their bodies. And he realized that if you were to let go of the habits, you had to draw the mind back out of the body. You had to untangle and to let go of the body mentally. And then the joints would free, muscle balance was restored, and movements would coordinate. Sound familiar? So Delsart's goal, of course, was different. His goal was for the body to be a clear channel for gestural expression, so that the inner feeling could actually naturally become a natural outer gesture. And it was the first time that, again, there'd been a method teaching people to allow natural expression on stage rather than the formal stagey stuff. And of course, there's been a lot of other such methods since, such as the Chekhov, but Delsart was the first, as far as I'm aware. So he was hugely successful in France, round about 1840 to 1860. Then he semi-retired, and his last pupil was an American, Steele MacKay, who he said was his last and his best pupil. And they worked in 1869, and MacKay then took Delsart's system back to America, and he launched it in 1871. It was picked up straight away by some of the main acting schools there in Boston and New York, and it became the primary way of training actors for 30 years. Popular books followed, appealing not just for actors, but also for the general public. Genevieve Stebbins, that many of you have heard that name, was the first of these Delsartian authors, as I call them, the ones who followed from Steele MacKay. And it became the yoga or Pilates method of the day, with weekly classes for ladies. So it was very popular. But that was all in the USA, and FM was in Australia. So how could he have found out about this method? Well, Melbourne in the 1870s was a very wealthy city with a very thriving theatrical scene. And so there were big promoters bringing actors in from UK and from America. And I think the Australians were already interested in natural methods. They had no acting schools. And I believe that the books and the methods of the Delsartian authors would have found their way across, probably through visiting actors and singers. And I have no evidence of this, except that FM knew it. FM taught it, and FM advertised himself as a Delsart teacher for a while, suggesting that he knew there was a market of people who knew about Delsart and wanted to learn it. So there must have been awareness out there and people teaching it, but as yet I've got to find it. So let's do the first exercise that is in all Delsartian textbooks, which goes by the unlikely name of decomposition and recomposition. And so just to say that the way they saw it was that muscles were activated when nerve force energy flows to them, which of course makes sense to us now in terms of it's an electrical flow, which they didn't actually know then, but they realized there was a flow of somehow nerve force energy flowing to the muscles to activate them. But with the mind over involved in the body, you get poor movement habits, creating muscular imbalance. And so what we need to do to clear the mind from tangling in the body, we need to withdraw that nerve force energy back to the energy centers. The base of the brain or the center of the body, different authors state different places, but always it's from the extremities to the center. And then we can flow it back again from the center back to the extremities. Because the channels are then clear, we can then recruit a new balance of muscles that brings more harmony, more balance, more coordination. So let's try it. If everybody wants to stand up. And I want you to stick your hand out to the side and just start with, oh, I'll put another light on. I've only got one of my lights on. Sorry, no wonder it's a bit dark. That's better, isn't it? So just to start with, just make your fingers fold and unfold. That's a doing action. And this time we're going to withdraw the nerve force. And you'll find that if you withdraw the nerve force back to the knuckles, the fingers will just fall. And then you can flow that energy back through again, and they will come back again. And again, just withdraw that energy back to the knuckles. The hand is still alive. The fingers are now like dead things. Let the thumb go as well. Everything is just floppy, but the palm is not. And now flow it back to the wrist. Withdraw the energy. The hand is now a dead thing. You can flow it back through. and you can withdraw it. And it's now just floppy, but the rest of the arm is still awake, alive. And now we're going to withdraw it back to the elbow. Your upper arm has to change orientation to let that one happen, of course. And there's the floppy lower arm, but the upper arm is still activated. And now I'm going to withdraw it back to the shoulder. And the whole arm is now floppy. And now I'll withdraw it from the shoulder itself even. And the whole shoulder arm unit is now a floppy thing. And we've withdrawn it back to the center of the body. And now let's flow it out again. So we're going to flow it back to the shoulder. Feel that shoulder tone up again. And then flow it through the upper arm to the elbow. Be very clear. This is a real case of being mentally clear where you're flowing it to. Just to the elbow. The lower arm is still decomposed. And then flow it through to the wrist. So the lower arm comes back to life, but the hand, again, is still a floppy thing. Flow it through to the knuckles. Flow it through to the fingertips. And the thumb. And let's do it one more time. Withdraw it from the fingertips and the thumb back to the knuckles. And just check. They're dead. They're gone. Flow it back to the wrist. Again, it's a dead thing. Flow it back to the elbow. It falls. It just falls. Flow it back to the shoulder. Flow it right back to the center. Everything is just toneless. It's lifeless. And then flow it back again. Feel the shoulder tone up. Flow it back to the elbow. The lower arm is still decomposed. Flow it through to the wrist. Flow it through to the fingers. Flow it through, to the knuckles. Flow it through to the fingers. Right to the fingertips. And then take that hand for a little gestural dance. Is there a difference in how that hand now moves? And if you pick something up, like a pencil or your phone or something, is there a different quality to it? Is there a different weight to the arm? How would you gesture with that hand now? And let's try the other arm. Again, just put it out to the side. And again, let's just fold the fingers down, do it, and take them up again, just to see the difference of when we withdraw that energy, being very clear of where the knuckles are. This is real body mapping stuff. Draw it back to the wrist and flow it back again. The knuckles, the fingertips. And again, withdraw it. You can almost feel it withdrawing joint by joint, down to the wrist. And the hand is dead. There's nothing going on there now. Flow it back to the elbow. The lower arm is now a dead thing. Flow it back to the shoulder, and the arm drops. And it's now, you can just swing it around. There's nothing happening there. And flow it right out of the shoulder, even back to the center of the body. And just feel it sort of droop a bit. If that's what you feel, that's what I feel there. And again, now let's work from the extremities to the center, from the center to the extremities. Flow it back to the shoulder. Feel it wake up. Right back to the elbow. But the lower arm is still decomposed. Back to the wrist. Be very clear where you're sending it to. Back to the knuckles. Back to the fingertips. One more time. Withdrawing it to the knuckles. Withdrawing it to the wrist. To the elbow. To the shoulder. And back to the center. And back again. To the shoulder, but the arm is still dead. To the elbow. The lower arm is still nothing happening. To the wrist. To the knuckles. To the fingertips. And take this arm now, again, for a little fly, a little explore in the air, whatever you want. Pick something up with it. Just feel the difference. The other hand is still engaged as well. And again, if you make a gesture Now, what's that like? Is there more life in it? Is it different? So, would anyone like to comment? What's that like? What did you experience there? Sue, you unmute? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I have. Much looser. The arms are working. I recently had a stroke, and this whole arm had gone. But doing that exercise, I felt it coming back,
Wow.
and I could actually hold a pen, which for me is amazing. So thank you.
Well, that's just amazing. Wow, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Sue. Yes. Keep working with it.
Yes, I will.
Beautiful. Yes.
Thank you.
What else? Nobody's going to cap that one, but please do share. What else did people experience there?
It's just a wonderful technique to get the arms.
It really is, isn't it? Yes. Yeah.
I'll mute myself now because I have a dog.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? Carol.
I feel my arms feel so much more at ease and poised
Nice.
and life, but yet it's just so much more at ease, comfortable.
Beautiful. Thank you. Absolutely. Patrick.
No, but I don't think you'll like it.
Yeah, I think both my arms feel more all of a piece, so that the movements are movement of a sort of a larger system rather than sort of broken up. So maybe, what was the phrase? Yeah, maybe my mind is less tangled in my body. Might be.
Nice. Just might be. Yes. Thank you. Wes.
It really seems to me that that's the origin of inhibition and direction.
It really does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah. It's so clear. Yes. And direction, not just as a projection from the brain to the body, but actually a flow of energy as well.
Right, a flow of energy.
Which is what he writes in Use of the Self.
Right, in that footnote.
In that
Connecting
footnote.
the energy to the parts, and it's in that footnote.
Yes. Yes. When I use the word directing, in such phrases as directing the use, I don't just mean the sending the message from the brain to the mechanisms, but also in conducting the energy necessary to the use of those mechanisms.
Right.
It involves a flow of energy, and that's what
Right.
we've just seen. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, Wes, for that. Anyone else want to comment? Did anyone's arms just feel lighter? So, yes. Great. Marion. Did you want to say something, Marion? Do you want to unmute?
When I extended my energy outward to the fingertips, it really opened up my chest and opened up my breathing completely. And it opened up my back. It drew me away from the ground. It was a good experience.
Lovely. Brilliant. Thank you. Yes. It gets at more than the arms. Beautiful. Thank you. It's very integrating, isn't it? Yes. And brings the flexors and the extensors back into balance. So there's evidence in Alexander's writings, not only the use of the self quote that I've just given you, but also he also talks about somewhere he talks about not just flowing the energy, but then cutting the energy. There's a couple of points where he does that. as well. So you can compose and you can decompose. And I wonder also if it's the basis of table work, and why table work was initially called inhibitory work, because again, when you take people's arms on the table, that's again what you're encouraging them to do, to just decompose them for a while and then let the energy flow through again. So I think he had a good foundation in Delsarte before his voice problems. And it gave him the knowledge that all poor habits have their roots in the mind, and you need to let go of these to allow something different to happen. And that this also can feel wrong. There's a number of the Delsartean authors who make that point, that when change happens at this fundamental level, it feels wrong, it feels weird. And people will want to go back to their old habits as a result, but you've got to persevere. Delsarte work would have developed his body mapping, the reliable awareness of the joints and what those joints can do, their limitations, the way they move, and a knowledge of the parts of the body, giving the awareness and the freedom to convey emotion and meaning with his body. And also Delsarte work would have given him knowledge of oppositions. This is stuff we'll go into on the course. It would have given him knowledge of oppositions and taught him early forms of procedures, such as coming on toes, sitting and standing, tilting forwards and back in a chair, taking a step, and walking, all with harmonic poise. The Delsartean term, harmonic poise, and I think he simply renamed that mechanical advantage. So we'll investigate these various Delsartean theories and methods in the new course, and you can make your own decision as to whether you think Alexander did work directly from those to create his own methods, because they are slightly different, or whether perhaps just with that basic understanding of Delsarte work, he could, travel a parallel path and find these things for himself, because that happens too. Very often people don't know about each other and yet can develop the same stuff. So that could equally have happened. And I don't want to tell anyone what to think. I just want to give you the evidence, the facts, my hypotheses, and you make up your own mind. So in Melbourne, FM was spending his evenings in acting training and preparing for performances, giving performances. He even directed plays with his amateur production, apparently. And he got rather good. He started to win competitions. And that is when he decided to turn professional. So he increased his time spent on the vocal exercises and his training and so on, and that is when his voice gave out. His poor health had continued with breathing attacks and very much lowered vitality. This is something he writes about in that little autobiography that he wrote in the 1950s. And he'd had sympathetic bosses who'd let him take work home and do it in his own time. And he'd had a more serious attack at one point that meant his doctor sent him to the seaside for 3 months to recover fully, to get him out of polluted, overcrowded Melbourne. Because at that time, I mean, now it's cancer and heart disease that are the top killers. But then it was tuberculosis and bronchitis. It was all the respiratory diseases that were the top killers. And that was so in all the major cities, probably mostly because of the pollution from coal fires. And so when he came back from the seaside, his aunt and uncle, who he had been living with, had moved on, and he went to live with his voice coach, Fred Hill, whose father had been T.E. Hill, who was the famous author of the book on oratory in Australia of the day. And yes, Mary McGovern asks, what do you mean by breathing attack? Was it like an asthma attack, a coughing attack, or what? Well, we don't know. Many preterm babies go on to develop asthma. And so one could presume that it was a sort of asthma attack. It certainly left him wiped, I think, which again would fit with it being an asthma attack. We only have, the name that they gave it at the time. So that's all I can tell you. There's various different accounts of it, but they all basically come to the same thing. Probably asthma, I suppose, but really based on, I guess, the malfunctioning of the lungs. I don't know. So it has been speculated that Fred Hill would have inherited his father's library of books on breathing and voice when he passed. And since the voice problems, probably of Alexander's voice problems, probably occurred while he was living with the Hills, and so young FM would probably have turned to books for solutions at that time, and there he would have found Hartley's Natural Elocution and Brown and Benke's Voice, Song and Speech, a practical guide for singers and speakers, and also Leo Koffler's book, The Art of Breathing as the Basis of Tone Production, probably right there on Fred Hill's shelves. So, because we know he read those three books, because he quotes from them in his very first articles in 1894 and 1895. And all those three books state very clearly that if you have a voice problem, you cannot start by addressing the voice problem directly. You have to start by addressing the underlying breathing problem. And FM actually writes this then in his early articles. In fact, all his early articles up to 1907, all start with that premise. You have to start you work with your breathing first. And because FM, who had breathing problems from birth, he must have realized the truth of this for himself. The Brown and Benke's book and also Koffler's book both provided clear methodology to find whole body breathing to support the voice that's based on science and anatomy. Because most voice coaches of the time, their methods were based on poorly understood hand-me-down ideas, which were pretty inaccurate. And people like Brown and Benke were really looking to put a more scientific basis onto the voice and onto breathing. So I speculate that this is where FM started, coming out of the clavicular breathing that he'd done from birth, and first to abdominal and then to full chest breathing. So how did he do it? FM later wrote in 1906 that, well, most authors focus on the in-breath as maximizing the amount of air that a singer or an actor needs to take in. FM says, actually, he focuses on the out-breath. And Koffler and Brown and Benke both discuss the importance of the out-breath, but I feel that neither of them discovered how to carry this plan through as fully as FM did. So anyone who's got the book Aphorisms, or found them in another one, they're reprinted in various books, on page 60 of that one, if I don't breathe, I breathe. It's a wonderfully strange little aphorism. It's clearer in the 1908 article. If you want to tell somebody how to breathe, tell him not to breathe, because he's got all these poor breathing habits and he just goes straight into his poor breathing habits. You've got to stop him breathing. And then I think it's a case of stop doing the wrong thing and the right thing will do itself. So he gives it in the 1908 article, but I think this was actually the first thing he would have had to have mastered before anything else. And years later, he would tell Frank Pierce Jones, page 31 of this book, Frank Pierce Jones's book, of how he learned to use his hands in a different way in teaching by applying the inhibitory control, which had proved so effective in breathing and speaking. And there's again a little key that actually it was the breathing control, breathing and speaking had come through inhibitory control. So it would seem that the key to his unique method was inhibition, not, as we've been told, the inhibition of the head-neck joint, but instead the inhibition of waiting at the end of the out-breath, inhibiting the habitual in-breath, which most people do so imperfectly, so that instead the body's organizational systems will take over and organize a spontaneous and full natural in-breath, and it will recruit a completely different muscle balance. And he writes, I do not claim to have discovered any new method of breathing, but understand the only true one, nature's. Right from the start, I think he's using undoing, not doing as the cornerstone of his method. So let's get everybody to lie on the floor and we'll have a go at what he might have done. So if you want to find yourself a yoga mat or something to lie on, you can put a head and a book under your head to be comfortable. And I'll just keep talking while you do that. Because while Koffler and Brown and Benke discover the importance of the out-breath, they don't describe using it to find the in-breath as FM does, and as Carl Stour would later do, for those of you who've worked with Jessica Wolf. And so where did he get it from? I can find only 2 other teachers of that time who used the long out-breath as a method for allowing a spontaneous in-breath, and they're both too late in their writings for FM to have picked up on, but the methods maybe have been around to draw on. One was Emily Bishop. She published hers in 1895. She's a Delsartian, and it's possible that this exercise was in Delsartian methods somewhere. Usually the Delsartian methods are more in-breath focused, so it was nice to find that one from Emily Bishop. And the other one is Benke's daughter, and that wasn't published until 1926, but again, maybe it had been around in the Benke methods elsewhere that I don't know about. Either way, whether he discovered it himself or whether he used someone else's method as an exercise for his own work, he made it his own non-doing approach as the cornerstone, and he developed it. Stop doing the wrong thing and the right thing do itself. Whereas all the other authors, the minute they've got this inhibitory method going, they actually return to more doing breathing exercises. So there's a real difference there. So there we are lying down, and let's use the Delsartian method that we've just found. So let's come back to pretending we've been a preterm baby, and clavicular breathing, and just being aware of if you put a hand on your chest, because you can clavicular breathe even on your back. It's a bit harder, but you can do it. And you probably all have pupils who breathe like this. And you can feel the strain up into the throat that comes from it. Now the diaphragm isn't really working, and it's all up here. So now let's decompose this area. Let's withdraw the energy from the clavicles. Withdraw it from the ribs. Withdraw it from the chest. Withdraw it from the neck. And let the breath, the out breath, just be full. And then let it rest there. Just wait for as long as you can, and maybe a little bit longer than you think you possibly can. Some people are more determined to breathe in than others. And then at a certain point, a spontaneous in-breath will happen. And the more you can get your mind untangled from your body, for this one you might like to draw the energy back to the base of the brain so that it's as far away from the lungs as possible. The more you can withdraw the nerve force, the more you can then let the body find its own way. So again, just thinking, I'm withdrawing the energy from the clavicles. I'm withdrawing the energy from the ribs. I'm withdrawing it even from the floating ribs. Just let it all go. Start letting it go from your shoulder blades. Withdrawing the energy from your neck, from your larynx. Withdrawing it from your face. And again, just waiting at the end of the out breath. Until the in-breath finds its own way in. And again, wait at the end of the out breath. Keep decomposing. Keep withdrawing the energy right back to the base of the brain. You're getting the mind out of the way. And those of you who know of my work with Miss Goldie will know that she told me, bring your mind up out of your body. And I'm very certain she got that from FM, even though she didn't tell it to anyone else, and it's not written anywhere particularly, but it was one of the most important things she taught me. And here it is in Delsart. Bring your mind up out of your body. And let the breath go. Just let it wait and wait and wait. Just staying out of the way. How much can you stay out of the way? Just keep decomposing. And you might be aware of your diaphragm coming into play, of how the elasticity of the in-breath comes into play. You don't have to haul on anything to breathe in. It's not any work at all. The in-breath will just happen, and then the out-breath can follow. And it all becomes much gentler and much simpler. And this spontaneous in-breath that hopefully you're now all experiencing, Alexander named the primary movement, the true primary movement of the respiratory process. And that gives us the thoracic mechanism, as he called it. And we'll be exploring, on the course, we'll be exploring his full respiratory method, right through to vocalizing, from the evidence that there is in the early articles. And which incidentally helped my own voice recover, even though it's a bit raspy and hoarse again today, because I'm fighting off yet another cold, courtesy of my sweet grandchildren. But yesterday I actually had my voice really good again, and then today it's gone because I've talked a lot. So, but his methods really work, and I'm working with them all the time to keep my voice healthy and happy. And most of the time it's just amazing. So let's come back. Now, please do tell me what you found, what you noticed, what happened for you. Marion.
It made me realize why I love your voice so much. It has such kindness in it and such flow, and you just express your thoughts with such fluidity and connected to your body. I realize how you're accomplishing that. An element of how you're accomplishing that.
Thank you, Marion. I can tell you it's taken years and years of work. My voice used to be so harsh once upon a time. Yes, but it's work that's been well worth doing. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else like to talk about how that was? Did you find that spontaneous in-breath? Maybe you're familiar with this already. Marion again?
Well, there's another thing. It's the kindness that comes to your breath. It doesn't sound to me like you're suffering from stage fright or any kind of sympathetic nervous system problems. It just flows so easily.
Thank you. Yeah. Somebody else tell me something. That's We're all looking happy and calm. So I'm going to sit here until somebody says something. Jennifer.
I was really surprised at how slow the in-breath was. And I don't know if everyone experiences that the same way, and it was very challenging for me not to interfere. It was very interesting how challenging.
Yeah, it is challenging, isn't it, not to interfere? And yes, I quite often have quite a slow in-breath. Alexander talks about the in-breath in the infinitesimal part of a second. And sometimes I find that, but for me, usually it's slower than that. Yes, thank you. Sue.
My back went into the yoga mat. Do you understand what I mean?
I do. Your back released into the yoga mat. It came back.
Yes.
It opened. Yes. So you actually accessed the back of your lungs.
Yes.
That's fantastic because most people are holding the back of the lungs really tight. Yeah.
It just went. I thought, oh my God.
Yeah. body was able to recruit a different balance of muscles. Fantastic. Wes,
Thank you.
thank you. Wes?
Well, for me, the breath came in quite quickly.
Nice.
Interesting. Another thing is, over the years, I've developed kind of my Alexander meditations, sitting and and one of the phrases I came up with that's really interesting that correlates with this is to withdraw all doing
Yeah.
from myself, to get so quiet.
Yeah.
And it's very just the idea, it's not really something any teacher ever taught me, but it's just something I came across, and here you are talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I later got that from Miss Goldie, that one has to withdraw all
Right.
intent. Yes.
Right.
Most of the intent isn't good enough. It has to be all of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So, yes, to what extent she got it from Alexander and Alexander was following on from this, I haven't a clue, of course, but it's striking in its similarity. Yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you. Anyone else like to chip in here? Some lovely smiles from Andrea or Laura, I can see. Susan?
What I'm noticing is that certainly with the exercise, I had a very full in-breath from my diaphragm all the way up. And then what I noticed is how much I was driving as I was attending, and I just stopped driving. So how much is holding in my shoulders. But underneath it all is this movement that's, being unleashed, basically. So it's like it's from within, it seems like the breathing can ultimately carry through my body even more if I keep doing it, keep with it. Does that make any sense?
It makes absolute sense. Yes, that's right. It's really working in a very integrative way through the whole body. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And the more we can stay with this, the more muscles can be appropriately recruited throughout the entire frame, right down in the end to your toes and the tops of your head, the top of your head and the fingertips. Yeah, it's extraordinary if you keep working with this. Thank you. And good for you doing it while driving. But did you notice that again, when we can get this going, the shoulders separate from the rib cage. The rib cage becomes independent of the shoulders. Yeah.
Yes. In fact, I guess that's what's been happening. And I'm just noticing, well, my shoulders could loosen up, but my ribs are moving much more. So there had been some compression, I think. And now that I'm breathing more deeply, if I can continue, perhaps it'll grow up into my shoulders and my neck and
Super.
toes and all. Yeah. Thank you.
Lovely. Stephen.
I'd like you to comment. So I've been doing this kind of breathing actually for quite a while. And so that part of it wasn't different. What was a little different for me was the idea of releasing energy rather than letting go of tension, which is the way I usually think about it. And I wonder if you could comment. What I think I felt was in letting go of tension is a muscular release that's a little more external, and releasing tension felt a little more internal. The result for me in this moment was that when I did the in-breath, it felt a little bit more integrated because of that release of energy rather than letting go of tension. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, again, I'll reference Miss Goldie on that one because she was very hot that if I released the body, then I was doing, and all I'd actually done was collapse the body. And again, one had to work from the mind to simply bring the mind out of it. And so I think it is about clear intent. It is about, is the energy flowing? Is the energy not flowing? We really are working from the brain, from the body mapping, and being very clear. Is my intent to make something happen here, or is my intent to leave it alone? And just taking the mind out of it. Whereas release, as you say, it actually involves the mind being in the body doing the release. So I think it is about, and then you don't get a whole body integration with it. When you bring the mind out of the way, it's this paradox that by by letting go of something, you actually let it fully join in and you get the full integration coming back. Yeah, so I think here this is right back there in Delsart. Yeah, super observation. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yes, good to see you, Jan. Okay, anyone else want to comment? Let's carry on. And in 1906, in his discussion of reawakening the thoracic mechanism, FM refers to the primary movement. It's also in other articles and also in MSI, and it refers to different things each time, because in 1906 it's the primary movement of respiration. 1903 it's around other exercises. In MSI it's the primary movement of walking. Because Carrington and others read these works after reading Use of the Self, I think, they assumed that this primary movement referred to primary control, the movement of the head leading forward and up off the neck. But if you read the early articles as the starting point, it's very clear that that's not what he's talking about. The primary movement of the respiratory mechanism is this natural spontaneous movement of the in-breath that recruits a different balance of muscles, widens, deepens, and lifts the chest, and then sets the tone for the balanced out-breath and for everything that then follows. So does taking the head up feature at all in these early articles? Well, yes, it does. In the early articles, FM writes that you must take the head up because pulling the head back and down tightens the neck, which tightens the larynx, and that will stop anybody from speaking and singing freely. It's actually all about keeping the larynx free for vocalizing. And in fact, FM is not unique in having this instruction. It's in all the singing and acting and voice instruction of the time, which makes sense. And FM gives lists of all the things you've got to do, of which don't pull the head back is one of them, but it's not the one he italicizes. The only one that he italicizes is the key one for the torso mechanism. And he is not interested in the head at that time. He's interested in the torso. He's interested in getting the thoracic mechanism working. In the 1940s, FM told Trevelyan, a man hasn't lived until he can widen his back. Now, if you were to fill in the sentence, a man hasn't lived until, what would you put in? And it's interesting that FM didn't say freeing the neck. He said widen the back. What must that first in-breath have been like to him? Just totally life-changing. A man hasn't lived. So breathing is primary to him. And in his articles, these early articles, he describes poor breathing as the cause of all health and posture problems. He's good on his big claims. So where on earth does the use of the self account fit with all this? Jan Fischer has pointed out that in the use of the self account, it's the discovery of how to prevent the pulling back of his head, which decreased the hoarseness and allowed his larynx and vocal cords to improve. The discovery that the head goes forward and up actually comes much later. And FM's quote in Use of the Self is, "This led me to a discovery which turned out to be of great importance, that when I succeeded in preventing the pulling back of the head, this tended indirectly to check the sucking in of breath and the depressing of the larynx. This marked the first important stage of my investigation. With the prevention of the misuse of these parts, I tended to become less hoarse while reciting, and that as I gradually gained experience in this prevention, my liability to hoarseness tended to decrease. What is more, when my throat was again examined by my medical friends, a considerable improvement was found in the general condition of my larynx and vocal cords." So I suggest that this initial discovery was probably made through the breathing work, enough to mend his voice to act again, and then to begin working with others. But as he continued to work on himself, which he obviously did for many, many years, in fact, probably all his life, he gained experience of working with pupils, and the importance of the head-neck-back relationship could have slowly evolved. And he went from just a sense of the torso to more of a sense of the whole organism. The very first lessons, as we said, that FM gave were for amateur actors and for voice. They heard him recite. They came up to him afterwards and said, "We like your voice. We like what you're doing. Will you teach us?" It obviously was special enough for them to ask that. And I believe in those early lessons, he was teaching people to breathe, because after all, if there was to be help with voice, he needed to start with the breathing. Breathing and voice were hot topics of the day. Voice problems were a major issue, I think, because the population had really grown, so that public buildings, law courts, churches, concert halls, etc., had got much bigger. Think of if those of you who've been into an 18th century church and then into a 19th century church, they're easily double the size. And there were still no PA systems. So people were having to force their voices to reach these much bigger crowds at the back. And the voice problems were the result. And then breathing problems were the number one killers, as we've said, from overcrowding, poor diets, pollution, especially from smoke from coal fires. So when he did these lessons with voice, with these first pupils, I think he was teaching people to breathe, but as part of that, he had to get their bodies into awareness and life to free off the thoracic mechanism. And in fact, I experienced that myself firsthand, because when I started reading the early articles, I thought, oh, jolly good, if I get a pupil with voice problems, I'll just plug in Alexander's method and we'll get it sorted in no time. And I discovered it didn't work, because their bodies were all over the place. They were so uncoordinated. I had to work with the procedures to get their bodies working, and then we could start working with the voice problem, the voice work directly eventually. And the procedures and the breathing work really went together. Eventually, they were coordinated sufficiently that we could work with their vocal mechanism. So I think FM, FM got there a long time before I did. That's what he was doing. And I speculate that he did bits of Delsart work with them, standing in balance, taking a step, perhaps leaning forward with hands on a chair in order to open the back. I suspect that was something that was around. People knew that there was more lung in the back than the front. Sitting and tilting backwards and forwards, sitting and standing. Maybe wool work. As we've said, he already had observation skills through his work with horses, and probably skills of calming and directing horses with intention and voice. Carrington writes that later on, they used to, FM's door would often be open while he was working, and they'd stand outside and listen to what he was saying. And Carrington said he was actually talking a load of absolute rubbish, but his voice was totally calming. And he said it was like calming a horse. They're there, calm down now. And that actually was the real communication that was going on. He would have had a sense of his body through the Delsart work, and he would have been able to use that to teach people, to teach his pupils to be aware themselves of their own bodies, because one can presume that most of his pupils did not have the background that he had. And so when Madribala says is that he told her that when his pupils were pulling their heads back and he was saying, just don't pull your head back, and they didn't get it, he was then putting his hands on and saying, it's there. So it was just instinctively he put his hands on to show people what he wanted. And one could then imagine that if people were, holding their arms stiff by their sides and so restricting their thoracic mechanism, he might get hold of their arms and wave them around a bit. And so that would then become gentle manipulation. And so gently he would get skill. And so the Alexander work began. So was he using Delsartian exercises as his early procedures and then turning them gently into his own procedures? The various voice teachers that he read also gave physical exercises to free things off, but they're all very doing their physical games. I don't see any parallel with with Alexander's work, whereas the Delsartians, it's psychophysical and it's based on mentality. So I think that's, it's not rocket science. That's what he was perhaps basing things on. So through the earliest articles between 1894 and 1903, one has the sense of FM finding his own voice. Initially, he uses other people's names and descriptions, but by 1903, he's making his techniques his own, beginning to give his own names to his work and finding his own way of describing them, having the confidence to describe his own experiences. And slowly, as he gained experience and his skill with his hands developed, doubtless he began to notice how the head influenced the rest of the body, eventually noticing that it moved forward and up, and the body followed, bringing lengthening and widening. And by 1910, and the first editions of Man's Supreme Inheritance, he had the beginning of a new model of the body, led by the head rather than the breathing, although primary control itself was not defined until 1925. However, breathing was still a crucial part of the work, even though it wasn't named as such, as it is the breathing that brings widening, and it sorts the thoracic mechanism, without which the body cannot come into mechanical advantage. And what I've realized is that the directions of primary control are the ones that he trusts the pupil to do for themselves, and he gets them to memorize it and recite it. But the thoracic mechanism must be sorted by him alone, and he never describes the method. If you go back and read CCC in his hands on back of chair, that's what you'll find. You say that the neck, free, head forward and up bit, and I will sort the widening of the back. I will sort the thoracic mechanism. So why did he stop talking and writing about breathing directly? So he'd moved to London in 1904, still teaching breathing and voice work. One of his people assumed, I think, that he came to London teaching the Alexander work, but he didn't. It was still the breathing and voice work at that point. And he wrote several detailed articles describing his work. He became friends with Dr. Spicer, who was a renowned ear, nose, and throat surgeon who helped him build his practice. He made links for him into the theatre and probably taught him much about physiology of breathing. In 1908, that's when FM's focus shifted, when he wrote the article Re-Education of the Kinesthetic Systems, which is actually reprinted in the back of MSI. Is it? No, only in the first edition, not subsequent ones. It's the first article not to mention breathing. And this, I think, is where the Alexander technique, as we know it, really begins. 14 years after his first work back in Tasmania, longer than any of us heard. The pupil rehearses and gives their orders while the teacher moves them. They cannot do it for themselves because they would rely on their sensations. They have faulty kinesthesia. And the head going forward and up is first mentioned in 1911. But there's another reason, probably. In 1909, FM makes a shift in his writing then from breath as the causative of all health and postural problems to physical coordination, one's use of the body, itself led by faulty thinking, as causative of all breathing and health problems. So he's turned it on its head. And this shift may have occurred as he observed and worked with more people. I mean, after all, breathing had been his own primary interference, from which had then put his body out of shape. So he probably assumed that that was the same for everybody. But as he worked on people, he must have realized that mostly it's the faulty coordination of the body, along with the faulty thinking, that's the primary issue. And it was these factors that then interfered with their breathing. Get the thinking and the use of the body right, and the breathing righted itself. And 1909 is when he first states this clearly. But there was probably another factor in this shift. because in 1909, his friend, Dr. Spicer, gave a lecture which FM saw as plagiarizing his own work. And this could have been disastrous for him because he was an uneducated, unknown man from the colonies, and he was up against an established doctor, a leader in the field. He would have lost out. So Alexander wrote a protest against Spicer, and Spicer responded with an article in which he recommended that the principles of back breathing that he advocates should only be should only be taught by qualified medical men and not be exploited by some irregular hypnotists, suggestion healers, physical or vocal trainers. Well, what a sideswipe. That's nasty. So Alexander split with Spicer and his promotion of back breathing, and he declared, "I consider it dangerous to suggest to the pupil that the act of breathing is of primary importance, and that he is to perform it with a particular part of his body. Given the perfect coordination of all the parts as acquired by my system, breathing is a subordinate operation which will perform itself." And from this moment, he never wrote about breathing directly again, and neither did he teach it directly again, as far as I'm aware. FM is always after nature's way. He's always after wholeness, and he follows through on this quest. And I think that of all the authors and methods around of the time, many of which claimed to re-establish natural states and action in breathing and movement, but they didn't actually follow through on that. They always brought in a bit of doing somewhere. They couldn't stay with the non-doing. FM had a deeper understanding of what was involved. He was the only one who stayed true to the principles that really would get back to allowing what I call the self-organization powers of the body to come back into play, to allow nature's way to come back. But if we are to get through to that understanding, we need to rediscover the path he took, and we need to understand the early methods that stepped him up to this point. And that is what the course I'm launching will give you, a much deeper understanding of many aspects of the work, of breathing, of whispered R, of the procedures, and so on. And there's a lot to learn. So just to tell you a little bit more, the new course starts on the 7th of April, which is not this coming Monday, but the Monday afterwards. And it's at 2 o'clock on Mondays, every other Monday. And it's 2 o'clock to 3:30 UK time. And it runs for 8 sessions, so it finishes by the middle of July. And I'll be sending, after this session finishes, I'll send you all the link to the recording. Everybody will get the recording. And I'll also send you the link to read some more about the course and sign up if you want. And anyone who wants to go ahead, catch it this weekend, because there's 10% off this weekend until Sunday night, midnight Sunday night. So, yes, questions, comments. What do you think? I've thrown a lot at you here, some of which may be familiar to you, some of which may be really unfamiliar, possibly even a bit shocking, who knows? And do tell me what you think. Wes, are you ready to?
Yes. With everything I've ever heard and read about the early papers, I think what your account is very accurate in my mind. So I wanted to tell you that. Again, we've been talking, but I could probably figure this out. But I'm wondering, about what year do you think that he first had his vocal problems?
The general consensus is 1892, 1893, somewhere between that. The last, if I'm remembering right, the last time that he performed was May 1893, and then there's a big gap in his performances. And then he goes to Tasmania and starts performing in February the following year. That's 9 months. So that's why the thought is that he got this together in actually under a year. That's possibly 9 months.
Right.
We don't know the performance, because he writes that there were important performances that he had to turn down, and obviously we don't know about that, but we do know that the performance in May went ahead, so presumably they were later than that. It really wasn't very long. Does that fit with what you understand?
Um, I don't think I really have a clear understanding of that, although, I did read all the early papers a few times, but I never really put together a timeline for myself.
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm quoting here from Jean Fisher and
Right.
others who've investigated all the newspaper articles of when the performances were.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So that's the evidence there, that there were performance. He was in performances up to May 1893, and after that there was a gap. Nothing
Mhm.
until Tasmania. So that's when we assume that this main, thrust of getting in charge of the voice problem probably was. But I think it would have been occurring for a year before that. But that's when the crux came, I think. So yeah, when he started the self-explorations, he might have started it before. He probably started them before that. He writes himself that he was looking for the exploration in conventional methods and not finding it, and then he had to develop his own methods to crack it. So yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And I sent you that playbill for The Merchant of Venice, and I was thinking about that because I remember, oh gosh, what was her? Luli Westphal said that so many people on the training course were resentful that they had to do this performance,
Yeah.
Merchant of Venice. And over the years, the more I've thought about it, the more I thought that voice work should really be an essential part of all our training.
Well, I
You
completely
know,
agree.
uh,
It's crucial.
yeah,
Because not merely does it stop you interfering with everything. I mean, if you're talking in a harsh voice, you're interfering with everything.
right.
But more than that, a well-modulated voice is taking you into the parasympathetic. I mean, this is modern
Sure.
science. It's back to that calming the horse thing. You need a calm embodied voice in order to calm your pupils down, and that's one of the primary things we need to be able to do. If we're trying to, get people to free their arms and we're talking at them in a hard voice, we're not going to be talking to the right part of the nervous system. So this is also why I think it's crucial that we do this work. And the one who did understand that was Irene Tasker. She writes about that in Connecting Links again, that she thought the voice work was some of the most valuable work she did with him.
Well,
And
yes,
Gunther's work, of course, was
we
amazing.
all do, we all do uh, the sitting, standing, bending over, walking, but we talk all day long.
Right, exactly.
And I mean, there's some teachers that don't even teach whispered awe anymore. And so I think it's a profound part of the technique that if we're going to embody the full aspect of being a human working on our speaking,
Yes.
very important.
Yes, and before that, the breathing, because if there's any, usual stuff going on in the breathing, every time people breathe out, they're actually subtly pulling down. And, here we are trying to think up and get everything lengthening and widening. If every time you breathe out, you actually distort that, then, you're up against it. And the full method that I will be teaching, there is support for the body, support for that lengthening and widening on every part of the breath. Somebody's just asked, Mary, thank you. Do I know anything about the origin of the whispered R? That's one of the things we'll cover in detail on the course, actually. So I won't talk about it here, but yes, there's a number of books actually that I think he got it from, and then developed it from there. But there's a really clear exposition of it, and I think with the whispered R, further he was then accessing the deep musculature. So I think that it's also, the breathing also gives you a key into the core musculature as we would now understand it. I don't like this modern distinction between structural posture muscles and movement muscles, because if breath is the source, is the primary movement, everything is always in movement. Everything is always being supported. Every single muscle in the system is both a postural muscle and a movement muscle. And I suspect that's how FM thought about it. He didn't want any division of the body. He wanted to always come back to the whole. And we are just one breathing, great big jellyfish, as it were, where the breathing actually powers it all. And I think he was teaching that to the end. Thank you. Anyone else like to comment?
I have one question, yeah. Did
Yes.
the Star Trek teachers use their hands?
Sorry, did the Delsart teachers use that? No, not as far as I can tell. Again, that's something that FM did instinctively, but that's not in any of the Delsart. It all seems to be verbal instruction for them. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. How do you pronounce your name, Desiree? Yeah, thank you. And Patrick, your hand went up, and somebody else as well.
Yeah, I'm just intrigued by this kind of doing, non-doing thing. And I've got a vague memory from that chapter, Evolution of a Technique, where he describes that sort of sentence says something like needing to put his head up, forward and up, put his head forward and up. Does that sound right? That kind of sentence?
Yes, he says that quite a lot in the early article, in the early in MSI and the early writings. That people has to remember to put their head forward. It's a bit strange, isn't it, that?
Well, it sounds quite like, it doesn't sound very non-doing.
Yes.
And I kind of adhere my own thinking to this. Perhaps this is a naive thought that the more you can get out of the way, the less you're doing, say, in your head and neck, but really it's the whole thing, isn't it? Then naturally your head will find that coordination with the rest of you in a natural way. So it's the non-doing that leads to that thing. But in that chapter, I think he really, that's quite disruptive in a way to this rather pure idea I've got of.
Yes, the put your head forward and up. I mean, it may be that for him, just like, when I asked you to move your hands around at the end of the Delsartian exercise, you were doing something, but you were doing it out of just a flow, weren't you? So I'm just listening to you and thinking, I wonder if you really get out of the way, you can, just like I can pick up my pen, I can make something happen. I can also put my head forward and up out of that sort of extension, just letting something extend. I don't know. That's just a thought that comes.
Well, that's just the thing that niggles with me.
Because one of the things Margaret Barlow writes in The Exam of Life is that she gets there's a scene where she's working with a whole load of teachers on a stage, and she's going through the procedures, and
that's exactly what I was thinking of too.
Yes.
People say there should be just a little bit of doing. No, not at all. No doing whatsoever.
No,
is that what? Sorry, I jumped in. I see.
Interesting, actually. No, that's another part of her book. No, this is one where she tells them to work on their procedures. They're sitting and standing, which she will eventually get to them, and she gets cross because they all just sit there and nobody actually moves. And she says, "What are you doing?" And they say, "We're giving our directions." And she says, "Yes, but directions are no use unless you take them into movement. You can give your directions, but then the change is made through movement." That the phrase is, giving your directions is laying down the pathway, but change is made through movement. And she wanted to see them actually getting in and out of a chair for themselves. So maybe that's, you give your directions and then you actually let your head go do it. But it's funny that he said put your head rather than let your head move forwards and up. Yeah, I agree. I have puzzled about that one too. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, as I say, I wish I could get him in a corner and
Yeah.
now there was somebody else who put a hand up. Who was it? Marion.
I know. I trained in the Alexander technique 50 years ago in London, and I had the most marvelous experiences from wonderful teachers. But my life has been tortured by not knowing, trying to figure out what is the right thing that does itself. What is it? I mean, how do I find it for myself? What what is that? And the way your description of the whole sequence of Alexander's evolution has filled in so many gaps for me. This is just it this it was just this is just a precious um blossoming of my training 50 years ago. So,
Yes.
thank you so much, Penelope. And
Thank
yeah.
you. You know, I mean, there's been times in the last few years I think, why am I doing all this research? But actually, I'm so glad I did it because I feel I have such a better understanding now, and it really has filled in a lot of blanks for me as well. And yeah, I already had a pretty full knowledge, but there were blanks there, and you don't know till you look. Yeah. Anyone else like to comment? So Jennifer?
I just wanted to say, like, I'm very new. I'm not an Alexander teacher yet. I'm just beginning, in a sense, training. And I just have to tell you that I got really interested in your work when I saw your interviews, excuse me, with Robert Rickover on YouTube, and the way you spoke about Miss Goldie and how she talked about inhibition. And listening to you today is reminding me again of the depth of that inhibition, the coming to quiet, the truly non-doing. And it's like you can't really, I guess we can't really emphasize that enough inside ourselves. And I just love how the way you think has, and your research has opened in my mind a more of a whole. It feels like it's more of a, what, Alexander talks about the psychophysical whole, and it's just amazing to me. So I really hope that at some point I can take your course and do more work, because I'm occupied right now with the work that I'm doing. But I really hope to take your course. And the one more practical thing I wanted to say is that for someone on the Pacific time zone, I'm wondering if you'll be offering your course at various times. This time was really good for me. So if it might be helpful to people who are far away to be able to have different time zone appropriate class times, because I think the time you're offering it at for me would be 6 a.m. It's just not possible. My regular job is teaching piano, so I'm all on afternoons in my body schedule.
Yes.
So I just wanted to thank you for all the work, and it's very inspiring to me.
Thank you so much. And yes, this is the second time I've offered it at 2 in the afternoon. And so next time I'll try and make it at later time that's more sympathetic to West Coast people. Yes, but yeah, it's the time slot that came free. Thank you. Anybody else like to share? Sue, I can see you moving your hand. It's still working, is it? Lovely.
I just want to say this. I've signed up for your course, the one that begins on the 7th. I'm hoping I can get it to work, but I will chat to Brenda about that. I just want to say, filling in all that gap, because I never knew about this art person. It had never occurred to me. Has filled so many gaps for me. So thank you. My heart. A book
So it's working. Isn't that amazing?
Yes, my cardiologist said, all your problem is in your head. It's not your muscles, it's in your head. And of course, I've released it, so I can do it. I mean, the cardiologist knew that, but he doesn't know anything about it. Like, I never talked to him about the Alexander technique. Next time I go and see him, I'll tell him about it. But he just said, it's your head that's confusing thing. It's not your shoulder muscles or anything. It's your head. If you can stop. And you're so right.
That's
So
amazing. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all. I do hope that some of you will want to join up with the course, because, you know, if we have a good group, we can just have such a great time playing with it all. And there is so much more to share. Tessa, do you want to say a quick word? Because you've done it already.
Yeah, I've dipped in this evening because I just love to hear about it, and it's the most amazing course and very enlivening and engaging, and yeah, really makes you realize that you can hold the baby and the bathwater, whereas I think part of it was thrown out, and now you can actually have it both. It's brings it all together.
Beautiful.
Thank you
so much. Thank you. Okay, so I'm sorry I've overrun. I'm a hopeless timekeeper. And thank you, and see you in Dublin. Yes, those of you who are coming to Dublin, and hopefully see you online before then. So thank you again, and goodbye for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Wes. Bye-bye.